Kia ora, my name is Anjum and I'm a Muslim New Zealander. I arrived in New Zealand as a 5-year-old child, straight into Hamilton, and grew up here, did all my schooling and education here. I have children who were born and brought up here, so I feel really grounded in New Zealand. I feel like this is my home, this is my place. I don't identify very much with anywhere else other than here. And because I've lived in Hamilton almost all my life, that really does feel like my place. And the Muslim community has changed a lot since we came to New Zealand. So when we arrived in Hamilton, we were the only Muslim family. And I think there was about 800 Muslims in the whole country. Now the Muslim community is well over 40,000 strong. So that's a big increase in numbers. And the thing with the Muslim community that a lot of people don't realise is the diversity. So you often hear people start a sentence with Muslims think or Islam says. And the thing is that Islam has a whole range of diversity within that religious experience. So you can have conservatives and liberals, you have various schools of thought, and a lot of theological debates on any and every topic. There may be a reasonable amount of consensus around some things. So pretty much most Muslims will say you have to pray 5 times a day, for example, or they believe in fasting, or they believe in going to Mecca for pilgrimage. But even around that and outside of that, there's a lot of debate and people can hold various different views. And then, of course, people may be practicing or non-practicing to various degrees. And on top of that, when you add on the cultural aspects, so for example, in Hamilton, which is the community I know best, at our mosque, we have 42 different ethnicities. And so as Islam travelled to all these various countries, the cultural aspects were incorporated into the way people lived. And often people will not have a sense of what is religion and what is culture. And so all these different cultural groups come here, they see people doing things in different ways and like, hang on, that's not how you do it, that's not Islamic, when actually they're viewing practices through a cultural lens and haven't realised that actually what they're doing is more cultural than religious. And sometimes they do realise that. And so we have, as I said, this community that's made up of all these diverse people, and we've just had Ramadan. We went to the mosque every night to pray, and you know, there'd be the Afghanistanis, the Malaysians and Indonesians, the Somalians and other Africans, the Indians, Fijian Indians, Pakistanis, like this whole melting pot of people all there together praying, and it's just amazing that we all connect really well. And I think that's something to do with being a smaller community, because once you get critical mass, all these groups tend to stick to themselves because people tend to look for what is familiar and what they can identify with. So we're a minority community in New Zealand. I think that we're a very misunderstood community. Not many people know about Islam, and what they know about Islam and Muslims is what they see on the media. And a lot of that coverage tends to be negative. We also have the case that there are politicians that will use rhetoric that is inflammatory and that is negative. We have some other extreme religious groups that also indulge in that sort of thing. And so what they tend to do is take the worst of what they see around the world of Muslims and portray that as the norm, as if that is what we're all really like. And as a community, we have faced a lot of hostility, and particularly since 2001. It has been difficult for a lot of our people in schools and workplaces, on the street, particularly for women that wear hijab, and not all Muslim women do cover like I do. Plenty don't. Some women cover more than I do and wear a burqa and cover their face. But when we do cover, then that makes us visible, and because we're women and we're seen as vulnerable, that makes us more of a target. And I know that a lot of Muslim women will say, when I'm out with my husband, I get nothing, but if I'm on my own, I will get people making harassing comments and so on. So as a community, often we feel under siege, and that plays out in terms of sexual violence because there's this fear that everyone already thinks we're awful. And if they hear about some sexual violence or something that's happened within our community, because we are stereotyped, they know that that thing will stereotype our whole community as well. And people won't just say that's a bad person who committed a crime against someone. They'll say, oh, aren't Muslims awful? Look at what they do. And because they do that, it makes it harder for people who have suffered from sexual violence to be heard and to get justice. Often it means that the whole community is thinking about how it will reflect on all of us, and getting justice for that particular person, if it involves injustice for a whole lot of other people, then those competing interests, and that makes it really unfair for those that have been through sexual violence or abuse. So, and I think that is something that the whole community has to take seriously. It's not something that the Muslim community can fix. Right, and we're doing our best. So we do things like Islam Awareness Week. We try and reach out and be involved in interfaith councils and involved in various activities and try and get people to get to know us. We try and do media work and provide other narratives. But at the end of the day, we're a small minority community in this country, and we can't do that work by ourselves. And those changing attitudes have to happen in conjunction with the rest of the community, or it won't work. And I think it is important, because discrimination against one minority exacerbates discrimination overall. And you'll find the research from like the Human Rights Commission and other places find that when there's a high level of discrimination against Muslims, that the discrimination against other minorities increases as well, because it makes it more acceptable to be hateful and to be bigoted and to be racist, and people treat it as like being brave and courageous to say something awful, and it's somehow valued to be nasty to other people, which is a sad thing. But it just, bringing it back, it just creates that climate that makes it harder for victims of sexual violence. In terms of our own community, I think that there may well be a perception within the community that sexual violence is not a problem for us. And that perception may be because we have a lot more segregation, that women cover a lot more, and so and that parents think they're probably a lot more protective. So they think, oh, this isn't a problem that we face a lot. Also because generally you'll find that Muslims aren't drinking alcohol, and a lot of violence, family violence and sexual violence occurs around alcohol, and so they think, well, we don't do that and we're not getting drunk a lot, and so we don't have this problem. The fact is that we do, that there is sexual violence within our community, and because we are a small community and a lot of the community is newly settled, not all of them, but it means that we haven't built up our own structures and institutions to deal with social issues. We've still got a lot of work to do in that regard. So it means that getting appropriate support for victims is really hard. They aren't enough professionals working in the fields of around counselling and victim support and those sorts of areas to provide the kind of support that brings an underpinning and an understanding of a religious viewpoint as well as the various cultural viewpoints that can support a person in that situation. And so I think there is really a need to build awareness within the Muslim community that actually, yes, this does happen, and yes, we are not responding to it the way that we need to be responding. Bringing it down more to a micro level, I think as with all cultures, often families and parents or siblings, close family members, they really don't know how to respond. They haven't got the understanding or the training. They haven't had those conversations to know how to respond if someone were to disclose sexual abuse. And often the reaction therefore will be one that can silence the victim. And I think that is across cultures, that we, even as a New Zealander, I feel like our whole society, we don't do that well, and we don't teach people how to do that well. Another cultural aspect is that for a lot of these communities that come from across Africa, Asia, Middle East, counselling is not a thing, right? And going to mental health professionals is seen as something that only the visibly mentally ill do. People who are like babbling or, show signs of visible illness. It's not seen as something that any other people would do. And if you had an issue, you're supposed to bring it to the family, and the family will get together and the family will talk about it. And it's often seen as a betrayal. So people think, why would you go to a complete stranger when we're here and we love you and we're ready to support you? Why would you go to someone outside the family and a complete stranger and go and talk to them about all of these intimate problems of yours? They feel like they're failing the person if that person needs to go and talk to a counsellor. So I think, again, we need to have more education around mental health professionals, around services available, how they work, what they do. They may also have a fear of losing their cultural and religious underpinnings. So if they send their loved one to someone who isn't Muslim, they're afraid that that person might influence the victim away from religion, away from culture, or blame religion and culture, or provide solutions that don't work within our cultural context. And so that can be another barrier to seeking help, because they just are not understanding. And it's true to say that, as I mentioned before, there aren't the mental health professionals that have a good knowledge of religion and culture that can support these people. So it's a two-way thing, I think. And that's where, it's hard to say what is the best way to go, but I think there is really a need for Muslim-specific services. I think we really have a need to encourage and train people from within our community to work in this field. And I know that it's difficult because it's not well-paying work, it's stressful work, it's not secure work, and most parents, and especially migrant parents who've dealt with a lot of unsettling and uncertainty and having to rebuild their lives, they want something better for their kids, and they want their kids to have a stable career and a stable job and a good low-stress environment. So they'll go for the engineering, the medicine, and those sorts of fields, law, accounting, and they often don't consider the humanities and the more, those sorts of areas like social work and counselling and psychiatry are not ones that will first come to mind. But we need to start making that change, and we need to start encouraging families to think about getting their young ones learning this stuff and being committed in this area, because we need those professionals. Also, we need, because as I said, we're a small community, we also need to be training existing professionals within mainstream services. And it isn't just professionals, it's actually all frontline staff. So the way that your receptionist is dealing with someone that walks in the door is hugely important as to whether that person is ever going to come back or not. And little things can be really off-putting. So if a client has not good English skills or is struggling to understand, talking louder and yelling at them, for example, is not going to help, and treating them like they're stupid is not going to help. It isn't that they're stupid, it is that they haven't had time to learn the language yet, or they haven't had the opportunity to learn yet. So knowing that, then the way you deal with them would be different than if you were like, oh, they're so dumb, they don't understand me, and that can create a huge barrier. So really, as a service provider, you need to think about all levels of interaction that you're having with the client, and think about how you can make that space welcoming for them, how you can make that interaction welcoming for them. The thing is, no one can be an expert in every culture and every aspect of religion. So it's about, I think, learning some basics, but also especially learning to get to know the person. And don't make assumptions, right? So even though I've said a lot of things here that are quite general and generalised, but the particular person in front of you, none of it might apply, and you need to actually find out where they're at, where they want to be at, what they believe. I mean, even in an individual's life, they move and fluctuate. So at some point of their life, they may have been liberal, now they're a conservative. At some point, they may have been a non-practicing Muslim, now they're practicing, or vice versa. Sometimes it's easier to talk about the things to not do rather than the things that you should do. So, for example, some things that you shouldn't do is blame a person's culture and religion for what has happened to them. And even though you might feel it really strongly, the thing is that when a person is really vulnerable, their community is really important to them. And often some of these people, and especially if they're new here, the only people that they are really connecting with are people from their own culture and community. That's the only people that eat their food, dress like they do, speak their language. And if you treat that community as being bad or not helpful or whatever, you're taking away a huge source of support for the victim. And similarly for culture, you know, don't question their choices of whether they wear a headscarf or shouldn't and whether that's oppressive or not. This isn't the time to be talking about those things, unless the person themselves wants to explore that, which is fine. But to be blaming a person or saying, well, if you didn't have this view, then it wouldn't be so bad. Again, it's not the right time. Again, when a person is really vulnerable, their connection to God is often the one thing that sustains them. And to attack that in any way is really to undermine a huge pillar of strength for them. Another thing to not do is to expect a vulnerable person to be a change maker within their communities. They can't do that. They're not in a position. They've come to you because they need help, not because they need to be sent out there to try and change the world. You need to help them work through where their strengths are and what they can do to make their life safe right now and what they can work on to make their own environment one that works for them, and based on what strengths they have at the moment, which may not be a lot. And so it's working on building those strengths and working on finding solutions, but not working on, well, you need to go out and make sure that people don't do this. Change making should happen from us, from people in the community who are in a strong position, not from someone who's vulnerable, who's been abused and who's seeking help. Little things that I find really off-putting is like, if I'm wearing a hijab, oh, do you feel hot in that? I get asked that every week. What if I do? What are you going to do about it? Do you think if I feel hot in that I'm going to stop wearing it? Would you walk around in a bikini just because you're feeling hot? No, you wouldn't, unless you're going to the beach. People, assume that people have thought about the decisions they're making and that they've chosen to do something because it's meaningful to them. And if they haven't, you can explore how they feel about that, but they have to want to address that and talk about that, So, yeah, that's what I think, to make it safe for Muslims. Also, be aware of prayer times, maybe just check if they've got a prayer time coming up and they need a 5-minute break to go and say their prayers, and maybe schedule the sessions around that. Or when you make the appointment, ask them what is suitable for them and do they need a break for prayer, or would you prefer to come at another time? Yeah. And I think being mindful of their connections. We come from cultures that are very strongly connected to other people and that don't have a strong individualistic ethos. And so you might hear people say you've got to do what's best for yourself. But for us, we can't be happy by making other people unhappy, and we don't want to lose our connections, and family can be really important. So we need to find solutions. We can keep other people happy, and it's not just about keeping ourselves happy. And so it's a matter of talking that through about where you can find a balance of not losing the connections that are really important to you and not losing yourself either, because you're just trying to please everyone. And I'm sure there is a balance, and people just have to be guided or, talk through how they can do that best for themselves. But for a lot of them, it never is, it's just all about me and I'm just going to do what I want. Because societies and communities and families, they don't work that way. You have to be mindful of each other and you have to care about each other. That's how they work. But I also think that some of the things that I'm saying about the Muslim community, they will apply across a range of ethnicities and across a range of religious groups. Some of these things will be very common, and some of the practices then should be similar in terms of getting to know the person. And, you know, as a professional, you may want to go and do some background reading if you know that you're going to have a client from a particular group and you think, I don't know anything about them, I don't know anything about what they believe. One thing that I think would be really useful, and I think it's really worth investing in both at a national and local level, is having advisory panels, having a group of people that a practitioner could call upon when they're dealing with a client and they're feeling a little bit lost and not sure of how to deal with it, and they can take a case to those people who have some minimal training in social work and counselling, not a degree or anything like that, but a bit of training, and who can provide some cultural background, cultural knowledge or religious knowledge and background, and help the practitioner to improve how they're dealing with that person, particularly if they're feeling lost. One of the problems is sometimes we don't see our own cultural lens, and so the practitioner may not even realise that they're doing something wrong. And so sometimes it might be useful to just check in with a group of people and say, hey, this is what I've been doing, this is what I've been saying, am I doing all right here? You know, because you can ask the person, but often the person in front of you has not been to counselling and doesn't even know what to expect and doesn't know that this isn't how it's supposed to be, or that they have choices, or that they can ask for something different or someone different. So I think it would be really useful to have that, and not just for sexual violence. I think such a panel could work across a range of areas like corrections, like mental health, health, a whole range of things. So, you know, as a policy initiative, I think this one would be one that would create a huge improvement in the way that we deliver services in the country. Because I think practitioners need to do continuing professional development every year, and I think it's time for professional organisations to start stepping up and providing training and being culturally appropriate. And we have done some of that recently in Hamilton, but it needs to go across the country, and it needs to be more regular, and it needs to be recognised that this is an area that is going to be growing, that New Zealand is getting more and more diverse, and even within mainstream people are beginning to be a lot freer and not having to conform, and in having little subcultures where they do things differently and where they need help differently. So again, it's a policy initiative, it's an area that needs funding and attention to ensure that going forward that our providers are able to provide the best help that they can to the people they need it.